everyone. Thanks for your patience in waiting for the technical issues. There's not much to show on the screen, so just bear with the flashing. Thank you for attending today. I hope you've all had a really great day of MIGs for the first day. Dialog plays a huge role in our games at Ubisoft. It not only fulfills the narrative, but it realizes the gameplay and delivers crucial world-building information to the players. Assembled here today are some stellar voice designers from some of our biggest brands, such as Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and The Division. And these guys are going to impart gems and wisdom about how they go about producing the thousands of lines of dialogue for our games. So without further ado, we'll get the guys to introduce themselves.
Oh, I think we're working. Okay. Hi, I'm Tim. I started my career in audio about 10 years ago in post for film, mostly doing ADR recording and dialogue editing. And then I got my first gig in the games industry working at Ubisoft Massive in Sweden on Tom Clancy's The Division. On a contract, I moved back to London and worked at a studio called Splash Damage as a sound designer for a year before going back into the Ubi fold in Toronto, where I've worked on Far Cry 5 and most recently Starlink.
Sorry, my name is Phil Hunter. I worked in film and TV as a dialogue editor for about 10 years in Vancouver. Then I got hired at EA Black Box, where I worked for 6 years as a voice designer on Need for Speed and one skate game. And then I moved to Montreal to start working on Far Cry, also for about 6 years.
Hi there, my name's Greg Newby. I'm working at Ubisoft Quebec. I'm the Associate Audio Director in charge of the voice pipeline. We just shipped Odyssey, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I've been working with Quebec for 7 years, principally in the Assassin's Creed brand, starting with AC3. And prior to that, I also was in TV and post. So.
It's going well. My computer needs to update now. Anyway, we'll just have it flashing. It's fine. Okay, so the dedicated role of a voice designer is pretty unique to Ubisoft. It's something that is a specialism and is a pretty big job. So what's the difference, Phil, between this and a kind of regular sound design role?
Well, generally speaking, sound designers work on sound effects, ambience, car engine noises, doors, that kind of stuff. Opening and closing. Bullets, bullet impacts, everything you can imagine that doesn't come from a human being, whereas voice designers work with actors and lines of dialogue, plus efforts that you hear during a game, onomatopoeias, things like that. And I think the voice designer role, as you said, is kind of unique to Ubisoft because Ubisoft puts so much darn dialogue in their games that it comes down to, like on the project I'm currently on, we have three voice designers.
And what are those type of dialogues? Obviously, we've got many different ways of delivering content, cutscenes. Tim, do you want to take that?
Sure, yeah. We tend to, well, at least as far as I'm concerned, divide dialogue into, I guess, 3 areas. Scripted dialogue, which is kind of one-off narrative-heavy lines that maybe only trigger once. Then we have what we call systemic barks. And systemic barks are just dialogue lines that are triggered by behaviors from the AI themselves, and they can happen multiple times. And then we have crowd life as well, Walla, which is very similar to how it works in the movies, where we record crowds, and they're treated generally more like a sound effect than a dialogue, and they won't generally be localized. Obviously, it depends on the game. And then, of course, cinematics as well on top of that. We tend to do that mocap.
Does everybody know what Walla is? You ever been watching a movie and there's a couple having a romantic dinner at a restaurant, and behind them there's all this crowd conversation, but you can't understand a word they're saying? They don't record that sound on set. They add it later, and that's just giving life to the crowd, which is something that AC does really well at often.
Just jumping on that, I guess one thing, when you guys were talking made me think of it, with voice design versus sound design. I think a big part of the challenge is that with sound design, you can make your asset at any time, you can improve your asset at any time, you can iterate. Whereas with voice, you're really preparing for a one-shot. You're going to have the actor in and you need your asset. So the planning is a huge part of a voice design pipeline. And the reason we want voice designers is it's getting ready for that. I feel like the majority of my work is thinking ahead for when that crunch comes, because when you start the recording process, everything has to be ready so you can move through it. And it's a really different way of producing your assets. And I think that's one of the things that makes it an interesting role.
And speaking about the recording process, is it something you do all in one go, or you do in a certain period on production? Productions are changing to being live all the time now, so.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think that's evolving, at least for me, that's evolving. I'm curious for you guys. Historically, when I started on Assassins, we would work up to that point where a script was locked, and now we're going to go into a deep trench of recording, like 2-3 months of getting assets. But more and more, like the game we just shipped, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, there's more work to be done in building these dialogues. We have tools now to build the dialogues, and there's more people depending on having the assets in earlier. So we're getting into more of an interesting, like, iterative recording process starting earlier to allow people to be adding animations, working on lip sync, facial expression. The amount of quality that's going into how these dialogues look has changed to kind of necessitate that voice be present earlier to unblock the rest of the teams. So that's a new challenge coming to us, and it's interesting.
Have you guys got any tools that you use to stay organized? What's kind of your go-to tool?
Well, I'm glad you asked. We have an in-house developed tool called Oasis. Oh, look, there's a screen capture. This is from Far Cry 5. Sorry for the blinking. Essentially, at a very high level, Oasis is a database that handles not just the written text from the writers, it also handles the translated text. Far Cry 5 shipped in 8 languages that had localized audio, plus I think 22 subtitled languages. So for every English line, there's 7 other languages that record their audio for that same line. Oasis also handles the WAV files as well. So when we record the line, it gets edited and named and thrown into Oasis. Then our game engine sucks it out of Oasis and puts it in the game. And again, that's for 8 languages. And it also handles the menus, the interactive menus that you see during the game. You know, you press pause, load, save, options, all that kind of stuff. Every background piece of information that you see about the weapon you just purchased, you dig deep into the game menu. You see all sorts of funny comments the writers love to put in. All of that is done in Oasis. It's kind of our one-stop shop for voice design. All of the systemic barks that Tim told us about. They're also kind of organized, laid out in Oasis. All of the script writing, cinematics, missions, absolutely everything in that respect is done in Oasis. Is that most of it?
Yeah, also there's one thing that we use it for a lot, which is planning and scheduling recording sessions and scheduling the lines that we need to record. That's a big part of it too, and it's very helpful with tracking stuff. Oh, really? Okay. Let's move
on. So actually, we'll skip to some recording stuff now. Like, how do you ensure that your sessions are structured to kind of get the maximum performance and productivity, but also whilst looking after the actor's vocal health? Because obviously the kind of bark stuff can be very stressful on the voice.
Well, that's part of the voice designer's role as well. We look at the scripts. Sometimes an actor needs to come in for a total of 16 or 20 hours to record everything they need to do, but obviously we would kill that actor if we tried to do it all at once. So what we do is we break it down into usually 4-hour chunks, and then we order the script in the way that the actor would appreciate it the most. So start with low intensity, move your way up to medium, some high intensity, take a break, and just rinse and repeat for 4 hours. You can always jump around, but the voice director and the actor, just for everybody's peace of mind, it's better to try and work in order. So that's usually the way to do it.
I think for us on our last project, an interesting development, as I was saying earlier, is that because we're recording earlier with these actors, was that I knew in advance that I wanted all our scripted characters to also have systemic voices and for those voices to match, so that if someone's in a dialogue speaking from the script, but then you bump into them and they're going to react to you, that they'll have the same voice. So as we were going, because we were bringing people in for these rounds, we would build up a script to a certain point and say, okay, go to record. In the background, I also had all my AI, thousands and thousands of lines that had to be recorded, and we would just fill in the session. So, it's never a good idea to bring an actor in for 16 lines. It's not really an efficient session. But if you have a bunch of barks, you can say at the end, okay, here you go. But as Phil was saying, starting with the onos or the barks, it can be extremely tiring, grueling sessions. It's not something you want to plan as a 4-hour afternoon. It's not going to get you good performance, and it's not fair to the actors. So,
I should say you do want to make sure that you've established a good relationship with your actors, right? You respect what they do, they respect the work that you're giving to them, so giving them as much attention in terms of, preserving their voice and not wearing them down, it's a good thing to keep in mind during development.
And also during the planning process, it can be quite tricky to organize a script in a way that facilitates that kind of order on the day. And I know something that you have talked about to me in the past, Phil, is actually adding to the structure, the projection levels in the AI structure of Oasis in the database, adding the different projection levels at a high level. So then we can quite easily order the different projections in the recording sessions.
Is that changeable on the fly in the session? Say you've got an actor who's not doing so well with all the shouts, that you can switch it up, or?
Absolutely. I mean, we use a sort of Excel sheet that Oasis exports, which is our recording tracking sheet, and we can jump around as much as we want to really in the session, depending on how the actor's performing, and that would just keep track of every line we've recorded. So one of our jobs as voice designers is to be in those sessions and mark each line as we go, and if any text gets changed because it's difficult for the actor to read or whatever reason, then we're tracking those changes as well.
Cool. So obviously, as a game, an open world game develops, the gameplay changes and the systems change and the systemic gameplay changes as the games go along. So how do you guys deal with the kind of often requests from gameplay and design that they want to communicate everything through a bark? So like, I'm down, I'm up, I'm reloading, all this kind of stuff. How do you manage that process? Because obviously those requests can come in super late, or they can all come in one go. Tim, I know you've got experience with this. Bark requests can come from all over, and often people don't necessarily consider the knock-on effects of what that bark request will have. If it's for every NPC, then it could be as many as 10, 15 actors that need to record maybe up to, 10 variations of that one bark. So you could end up looking over 100 lines you're going to add to the schedule just from that one bark request. So we've set up a pipeline recently which we affectionately call BARF, and it's the bark request form. And people who want to request a bark will fill in sort of an Excel sheet that comes to what we call a strike team, where we have different representatives from different departments that have stake in AI. So it would be AI and narrative and voice design and a game designer. And we look at these bark requests as they come in and validate whether there's enough return of investment on this bark and whether it's feasible. And then it goes through a very specific Jira pipeline, which helps us with every step of implementing and recording that bark. And do you test that with robo voice, or what's your kind of process for? Because obviously before you want it to be expensive.
Yeah, we can certainly prototype it with robo voice. Robo voice is just fake voice that gets generated by Oasis every time. Text to speech, thanks, Phil. Every time a writer writes a line, that gets automatically generated, so we can hear it in game straight away. Yeah.
Cool.
A really good example is one of my first weeks on Far Cry. I had an email from a game designer, and he said, "I want a line from every character that tells me that a grenade has landed by their left foot." It's like, okay, that's a weird request. But basically there's 2 or 3 of us that we call ourselves the reality police. So just because somebody asks for something doesn't mean that they know exactly what they want or that they're going to get it. So is a grenade landing by my left foot important? No. But a grenade landing close to that character is important. So you would want them to say something. So instead of saying, there's a grenade by my left foot, the compromise was, oh my God, watch out. And that was it. And that not only covers the circumstance that they asked for, but it also covers a bunch of other circumstances, like a Molotov landing close to them or an alligator popping up out of the water. So if you get enough varieties of this line, it can cover multiple contexts, but the user won't know that because it just feels like an authentic reaction. So you kind of have to filter these requests. It's not just a, you want it, you got it kind of thing. And that comes with just experience and prototyping and all that kind of stuff, because plugging in those contexts does take time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a good use of everyone's time to talk about their left foot and grenades.
I totally agree with everything you're saying. And yeah, I think as a voice designer, I think one of our interesting roles is to bring that to the table and say, and we will bring all the systems together. If a game has, 7 different features that are all going to be making requests, it's how can we optimize this and how can we make sure that the game is consistent. And not every designer is thinking about that. They're thinking about feedback, which is obviously super important. But as Phil said, over specificity is actually tiresome for the player. And I've had similar requests, things like, oh, if the horse turns left, say something. If the horse turns right, say something. But that's from a player experience, that could be extremely fatiguing. So a good practice I try to do in our studio is to make videos of the gameplay and then have the designer come in with me and say, like, let's see how this will work. Let's start laying voice over it. It saves time on implementation, and it starts making your feature feel real. And it also makes sure you're not getting just like a design running away with requests that aren't actually aesthetically pleasing. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting part of voice design, is to work on those features and making sure that the voice feels good.
Do you guys use any telemetry whilst you're actually in development? Do you guys use any?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah. On our end, we track each VO that's played during play sessions or during while developers are building, and it's a great way. I would start the feature with maybe one variation and wait for telemetry to come in. Ultimately, we may even cut the line because it's not playing, or we might say, oh my God, like this is playing a lot. We need to make sure we have good voice coverage. I think you guys do as well.
Yeah. It's a little hard to if you blink in time with the picture. But this is it's really hard to read, but it's the stim is called generic idle filler, and the column in the middle, not the blue, but the hex code in the middle is the name of each dialogue actor, and that tells us how many times they triggered this stimuli. So an NPC is standing around saying nothing, thinking about nothing, and he just kind of has we call them shower thoughts. Like, oh yeah, I need to go get some milk, just stuff like that. Has anybody played Far Cry? You hear characters talking to themselves a lot. Sneaking up on somebody, you'll hear them say something weird or normal. That's part of our idle filler. So we track that during play sessions, during dev testing. Why is this one guy saying this more than anybody else? That's kind of we need to know. Sorry, one other thing about the Barks design, I'm not embarrassed to say, during the Guns for Hire in Far Cry 5, they would announce that they'd arrived. Like, all right, I'm here, I'm ready to fight. And the original request was just that. We're here and we're ready to fight. And nobody in the AI or the voice design team thought that we needed any variance in that. So what if you're stealthing and this guy arrives? He announces, I'm here, I'm ready to fight. It's like, oh, shit. So we had to get a whispered version of that. We had to get a normal, and then if they arrive during combat, we need one where they're shouting so they cut through all the combat. We felt like 3 versions was enough. You could go with 5. I think Rainbow does like 10. But it's just those little moments of like, oh yeah, you had a great idea, but it could be even better, is kind of part of the learning process and the teamwork.
That nicely ties into another question about the trend that any person in the world is interactable. They've got their own life, their own story. They can take you on a quest, or everyone is a living, breathing character. So with the complexity of AI increasing, how do you guys think that you make it seem intelligent and real? Because the broader you go, the more you can reveal the holes.
I mean, I think that a lot of games are starting to try to crack that nut and make that be something where it can just feel simultaneously systemic and scripted, and it's a really interesting thing, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how to do that. I think one of the things with AI and the systemic stuff is that we tend to put a lot of emphasis on like them needing to speak, whereas I actually think I'm gonna butcher a quote here, but it's better to say. It's better to say nothing and be thought a fool than to say something and remove all doubt. And I feel like that with our AI. Sometimes I'm like, why did he just have to say that he saw me running? Like, I wouldn't say I saw someone running if I was walking the street, but it's kind of that we feel like, oh, we need everything to react. And I think in terms of giving the lure of intelligence is just getting the right moments. And I'm interested in progressing forward with more like, as you said, the idea that an NPC can have a story and take you, and we were working that a lot with Odyssey, with quest givers who can have branching dialogues, but then also have lines that if you come back to them, they can talk about things that have happened, and they will stay persistent with the character, and it's a really interesting, I think it's just a real interesting trend that's developing, and we're going to have a lot of work to do, because it's very tricky.
So with that trickiness of the characters all coming to life, Tim, what do you think are the strongest relationships that you can form within the wider game team, so not out of audio?
As voice designers, certainly narrative are probably the closest department that we work with, and it certainly pays to get your communication watertight with that team, because I mean we're working so closely with them. We, as voice designers, are essentially trying to make their lives easier and enable them to write easily. We have to prep Oasis for them so that they can just jump in and start writing, and it's very clear to them.
It's worth noting that Oasis is live all the time, so
Yes.
everyone is connected.
Yes, which is another reason why we need good communications, because it's pretty dangerous. If you delete a line in there, it's very hard to get it back. So generally the rule of thumb is never delete. Yes, so it's a two-way thing as well, because we often have technical requests of the writers that we need to communicate to them in the most straightforward way possible. A lot of writers are technically minded, but not all of them, so we have to adapt to work with them in that respect. A good example would be if a line requires a real-time radio effect because it's coming from an NPC in a mission who's talking to you down the radio, then how do we know as voice designers that we need to put that effect on that line? And typically we ask writers to include that in a parenthetical section of Oasis. So a keyword like radio needs to be there so we can quickly go through all the lines that need that radio effect and just batch add that, which we can do in Oasis. We can add AFX, I think we call it, right? Yeah. So it's very crucial that we keep those communications good and have a lot of face time with them.
The key thing with writers is that they're creative. So you have to do your best to not limit their creativeness and their ability to do what they need to do. If you just hammer them down with rules, you know, put this word here when you want this and do this and go into the grid and, oh, you didn't do that wrong, or, you didn't do that right. If you just stifle them with all these barriers and things, it's going to limit their ability to do what they need to do. So it's kind of our job to be the good cop, bad cop at the same time. Try not to scare them too much, but at the same time, they do have to follow certain rules. So it's kind of it's a balancing act for sure. We need them as much as they need us.
Yeah, I think that's another, like, again, I'm advocating for the voice design role is that in addition to, you know, getting the writers to work in ways that we have to then also think ahead to bridging that to the recording, and we have to bring their words to the actors and then ultimately into the game engine as well. So it's kind of being mindful of what that whole trip is and making sure that the context is given, that everything's going to be clear. Often people will just write in parentheticals like, oh, so-and-so laughs. And it's like, well, that's also a line, so we need to make sure we record it. Being mindful of those things and the technical requirements, you know, thinking of 3D positioning when it gets into the game environment, like, oh, I think that they shouldn't be whispering because it says they're on the other side of the room and the camera won't be there. if you're not watching those things and reviewing the scripts at script lock, it's going to get recorded as a whisper, and it's going to sound crazy. So it's really, I think, just trying to keep a big picture view on how the voice is going to work in the game and interacting with every team, because we really do interact with every team. It's pretty insane.
If you're an aspiring writer and you get your first gig, ask to attend the first voiceover recording session and simultaneously promise that you won't say a word. It's very common for writers to come and then provide feedback, sometimes wanted or unwanted. And part of the recording process is to record everything in the script that you need to that day. So if you spend half an hour on one line, not a good day. Depending on the day, I'm just saying, generally speaking, if you're breaking in, it's a good idea. It's very valuable to be there for the session so you can learn what your lines sound like coming out of the actor. You know, any input that you would answer questions, that kind of stuff, but you learn 10 times as much when you watch how the actor does what they do. It's an amazing process.
Okay, Greg, back to you. So on Odyssey, you obviously had the choice of playing as Cassandra or Alexios. How did you adapt your process and your tools to take that new change?
Yeah, we put a lot of thought into that. That was a big undertaking for us in the brand, and it was an exciting challenge. Interestingly enough, what Phil mentioned earlier about how in Oasis we can track localized languages, we got the idea that we can use that as a way of writing a male and female perspective in the same script for the same line, could have a kind of a duality that it could, if it needs to say he or she or Alexios or Cassandra, we could do that. So we started using that as a way to keep our script organized instead of writing thousands of lines, like if you're this player, if you're this player. That really helped keep it clean. And then after that, the biggest thing that we were just very mindful of was working with the Dialog team, the team that's going to be building these things, to make sure that we had maximum flexibility for our actors to have their own voice. I'm pretty proud of how we achieved the 2 players. I don't think that either was handicapped by it was working in that way, because we would sometimes have Cassandra recording first and then Alexios following. There obviously were some timing constraints, but we worked within in the engine to have animation scaling. So we never had one person have to do like truly ADR anyone, which would have been a nightmare in my opinion. And that allowed both Alexios and Cassandra to be their own strong characters. We also worked with procedural lip-sync again, so now we're not forcing them to any kind of lip timing. And in cinematics, we shot each cinematic twice. So the body acting was organic from each actor. And it was a big undertaking, but I think the results were really interesting. So it's cool. I'd like to see more of them.
How did you provide kind of continuity? Because obviously the story's branching and the character responses. How did you provide that info quickly to the actor to be like, this is your situation right now?
Yeah, that was, so yeah, we also developed tools on our game to start working. When we were looking at the fact that the game was non-linear, it became apparent to me really quickly that the recording process would be very difficult. If I give you a script that kind of is like a choose your own adventure, like if this happened, turn to page 24, and if that happened, come back to page 16, I was worried that actors would be just looking at lines being like, why am I saying that? So we actually, I don't know if we can do you have this one?
Yep.
We built a tool in-house, not this one, this one here, which allowed us to navigate the script as if it was branching. So if you actually see when it comes back, and there you go. So everything that's blue is actually our participant line in this case. So we can play the lines of people who have played previously so that we have good continuity. And then when I click on the line of who I'm recording, they can react to the other person's line. And that was a really great way to kind of make the experience in the booth with people who are all over the world feel organic. So you can just see they jumped off one into another, and now we're recording a second take. At the bottom of the screen on the right, you can see that there's the player choices. So that will allow the actor to experience, oh, hey, if I choose to say that you don't know how to make wine, this is what I'll get. Or if you're going to fail, then I'll get the other option. So it was really important to me that the actors had that information available to make the whole performance feel organic. And I think that's something that we're all pushing forward, is getting the context and the continuity and the game experience into the booth, and that's a big part of voice design. It's to help the writer's words be clear and the intention clear for the actors.
Cool. So let's switch over to the actual recording process and what influences your guys' choice around microphone choice and also the placement of that. I know it differs between you guys, so.
Yeah, I think every game's different. For us I'll just speak about Odyssey and I'm going to pass it to you guys. The first time our dialogues are very close, the camera was very close to the actors, or to the characters. And we haven't really had that as much on AC previously, or at least it's just all the dialogue. So we actually moved to a U87, which is something that it's interesting because then you're obviously getting that full proximity, the full spectrum, and then you have to balance that with how you're going to handle your 3D environment. And we had to work a lot with, with things in Wise to help compensate for the fact. But for me, it was really interesting to have that presence in the voice for that close camera. But I think that you always have to balance what your game looks like. So I'm going to pass it to these guys too, because there's.
Yeah, like you said, every game is different. We use a TLM 170. On Far Cry 5, we had 80 actors in 5 cities, and 1 in London for 1 session. So just for continuity, that was our thing. And our tech guys at Ubisoft would evaluate a studio before we recorded there. So they would get them to do conversational tests, yelling tests to make sure that it matched what they did in another city for that actor. But that's what it boils down to.
I'm going to repeat it again. Every game is different, for sure. Starlink was very suited to large diaphragm Neumann. I think it was a TLM as well, because of it was all over radio comms, and it had a kind of Saturday morning cartoon kind of vibe to the game as well. So which I believe is typical of recording techniques for those kind of cartoons. Another project I've worked on a lot of exterior stuff, and so we did some tests. We did an interesting shootout, which Steve helped me out with actually, through a few different mics, a large diaphragm and a couple of hypercardioid mics. And it's a fascinating thing. We recorded a few in-house voices at different projection levels, and we got them into the engine and got them playing back through the in-game Wise verbs to see how they'd react. And the mic that I thought I wanted, just hearing it raw, I changed my mind and went with a different one. Once I heard the way that the exterior slap sounded with that particular microphone, that was that really.
And Greg, you recorded a lot in Greece for Odyssey, right? How did you tackle that?
That was actually a really fun part of the project. We wanted to look at the crowd life and go for an ancient Greek flavor, and we started just doing some research and realized that there were theater groups in Athens who perform ancient Greek plays, and it's not literally analogous to, but it's similar to like the way a Shakespearean play would be performed by actors who are specialized in speaking an older version of English. So we ventured out and explored, and we met up with some recording studios in Athens that do dubbing, and they were very interested in what we were doing, and we got to bring our tools over, the tools that we showed there, and they did a really great job picking that up, and they were very eager and excited to be in the game, and I think it added a lot. It's something I would definitely want to do more on future projects, is looking to go to the location.
We use the term exotic speech at Ubisoft. Can you explain what that is?
So exotic speech is something that in the game would not be localized. So if you're playing the English version of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you will hear the Greek language. And if you play in the Italian version of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you will hear the Greek language. Those lines will not change. They're fixed, and they're there, kind of similar to what Tim was saying earlier about giving ambience and using exotic as a way of making the world feel alive. But if you use exotic language, it's kind of interesting because you're not interfering with the gameplay lines in the sense that people aren't like, oh, what did that guy say? Was he talking to me? Like, you know, it's part of the world. And it can really help create environments. Phil has some interesting stories about exotic as well, I think.
I'm trying to remember how to say it, but I can't. Did anybody play Far Cry Primal? Right. So the whole... so that... For those of you that haven't seen it or played it, it takes place 10,000 BC, and nobody speaks English. They speak a possibly fictional language called Pi. And so again, releasing a game where nobody speaks English and where not one customer, except for 2 language professors in Kentucky, will understand what they're saying. Every actor had to read their line phonetically. Every player that bought the game enjoyed the game without understanding a single word, so every line was subtitled. That was a challenge and it was a risk, and it slowed down a recording process. But in the end, it was requested by the narrative, by the creative team, and we met that challenge with some doubt. But in the end, it actually worked. When somebody's screaming at you in a language you don't understand, it has more of an impact. I don't speak French, so I can attest to that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's whatever's best for the game. And in that case, for Primal, that's what was best. And we weren't comfortable with it at first, but during the auditions, we learned quickly which moments worked better than others and which actors were more receptive to reading lines, performing lines they couldn't read. And it worked out well, I think.
Cool. So looking forward and looking into the future, what areas of dialogue would you like to see developed from either a creative or technical perspective in games?
This is purely from a sort of subjective viewpoint, but I have an affinity to kind of naturalistic sounding dialogue in games, and I think we're seeing more and more people paying more attention to performances and contextual wise, because a good example is Spider-Man recording every line twice, depending on whether Spidey is idle. Sorry for stealing that one. Depending on whether he's just walking around casually or slinging through the city, and I think it's shown in the kind of reception that got that actually does matter to players. I think, or it does make a difference to hear that kind of performance change depending on what they're doing, and I see more of that coming along, and I hope that's a trend that's going to continue.
I agree with everything Tim said. The return on investment is the only kind of red flag. Like, if you do record every line twice for every character in the game, that might feel fantastic to the user, but it might bankrupt your company, or it might require the user to download 300 gigs. Like, it's all a balance, right? What's best? What's worth the time? In this case, it's great. I'll try to think of something else while Greg talks.
Coming back to the original question of like what I like to see develop. For me, what's interesting is what's happening with the tools and the way we're building narrative, and the way that we're ultimately, like, the idea of Storyteller was to bring the experience of the gamer into the booth by giving them the options in the booth. I'd like to see more tools developing where we're writing in the game as the quests are being developed, and we're recording with that feedback in the booth as well. I think the more actors can visualize what's happening, the more the voice is starting to happen in the place where the performance will happen, that we're going to get better acting. It's something I'm really interested in exploring. I think, to Tim's point, the naturalistic aspect, the fact that any line can be said anywhere in any context is starting to become a reality. So you have to start to make plans for, well, what if he's next to a waterfall or he's in church? How am I going to make the same line work? We have to start looking at how our environments work and really just bring that engine experience into both the writing and into the recording. Do you think of anything?
So we're pretty much done with all the questions, so we're opening up to the floor.